Warning! All guards have been removed to show procedures.
For the purposes of this project, we will be using African mahogany, with the final dimensions of 2 1/4 inches wide, 1 15/16 thick, and 36 inches long. All measurements should be marked after the stock is squared. 4 1/4 inches should be marked out for the headstock, with an additional 1/4 inch measured out for the nut. A 16-inch length should be measured from the bottom of the nut to allow space for the fretboard. The fence is set at 1/8 of an inch, and a stop block is placed 15 inches from the front of the blade. Before tapering the body of the guitar, the center line is transferred from top to bottom. A 1 7/8 Forstner bit is used to complete the cutout, leaving a 1/4 inch space from the fretboard. A bandsaw can be used to complete the cuts if needed. An oscillating spindle sander can be used to smooth out any ridges. The fretboard should be cut to 16 inches long. Any hardwood will do. The fretboard material is cut to a 1/4 inch thick, using a table saw and a feather board, or a resaw bandsaw if available. The final dimensions for the fretboard should be 16 inches long by 2 1/4 inches wide by 3/8 thick. Double-sided tape is then used to adhere the fretboard to the fret cutting jig. It is important to line up the fretboard with the top notch of the fret cutting jig. The height of the fret saw must be set to slightly above the tang of the fret. Placement pin and table saw sled were built to the manufacturer's specifications. The excess material from the fretboard is now trimmed up. Part of the design included chamfering the end of the fretboard. An adhesive like Gorilla Glue is now used to adhere the fretboard to the body. Carefully place your fretboard so the frets are in the right direction. Excess adhesive must be trimmed off now so that when the nut is set, it sits true. The body of the guitar is now tapered. The top taper will measure 1 7/8 and go down to the bottom taper of 2 1/4 inches, which is found at the bottom of the fret. The arch on the neck of the guitar is calculated between the 2 points of the fretboard. And here the arch is drawn between the 2 points. The arch is then cut out using a bandsaw. It's important to hold on to the waste from this arch. It'll be useful later in assembly. The 1/2 inch headstock is now traced out. The material is now submerged in warm water to prepare for bending. The material should remain submerged for a minimum of 45 minutes. Begin the bending process using a bending jig immediately after the guitar is removed from the warm water. A clamp may be used if necessary. The bottom material is then prepped to 1/8 of an inch thick by 1/7/8 wide by 12 inches long. The bottom material is then submerged. The bottom material is then removed after 45 minutes of soaking. The material is then placed in the bending jig. After 24 hours, the material is then removed from the jigs. The bottom is then cut down to 7.5 inches. Stops are now glued in at the base of the guitar. The bottom supports and the bottom of the guitar are now glued into place. The back of the guitar is now prepped to 20 inches long, 10 inches wide by 1/8 of an inch thick. This jig is based on the geometry found in your handout under the bridge guide. For this jig, we use double-sided tape in order to secure the material. A 1/8 router bit is set to 1/8 of an inch depth in order to make the saddle slot. The ends of the saddle slot are transferred down, and the design is laid out on the bridge. Center of the saddle slot is now marked out. A line is now marked a 1/2 inch down from the saddle slot. Peg holes are now marked evenly along the line. A peg design is now laid out based on the spacing. A number 8 countersinking bit is now used to drill out the peg holes. The saddle is now formed. The inside and outside shape of the body is now transferred onto the back. The soundboard is now glued onto the body, placing it tightly against the fretboard to ensure a proper fit. The center line from the body is now transferred to the soundboard. The sound hole is now marked out 21 inches from the top of the fretboard. A 1 7/8 Forstner bit is used to drill out the sound hole. Bracing for the soundboard and bridge are now cut to size. The bridge supports are placed at 27¼ inches. Supports are rounded and ripped to 3/8 of an inch. Supports are cut to form the internal structure of the guitar. Supports are glued to the back of the guitar. The back is now rough cut out using a bandsaw. Excess material from the soundboard is now trimmed off using the bandsaw. The sound hole is now re-drilled. The back is now glued onto the body of the guitar. The excess material is now removed from the body of the guitar. The front of the bridge is now marked out at 24 1/4 inches. The center line is now carried down the body of the guitar and lined up with the center of the bridge. The headstock of the guitar is now cut out using a bandsaw. The center line is then transferred down the headstock again. A line is now placed 1/2 inch from the center line on either side. Three peg holes are now evenly spaced along these lines. Peg holes are now drilled out. The bridge is now glued to the body of the guitar. After drying, the peg holes are drilled out. The neck of the guitar is formed with rasps and files. The final form of the guitar is formed with a sander. Do not round the area of the headstock with knuckles. For fretting, you will need fret wire, fret snips, a hammer, clamps, and scrap wood. Fret wire can be hammered into the fretboard, fret wire can also be clamped into the fretboard. After installing frets, they should be filed smooth. The nut is now cut to length and formed. The top of the nut is marked. The nut is sanded down to be 3/8 of an inch tall. The grooves for the strings are spaced 3/16 from the edge and 5/16 apart. Grooves for the strings are made with a file. The bigger the string, the bigger the knot you need. The back edge of the nut is rounded. The nut is now glued in place. The saddle is now placed in the bridge. This height can be adjusted to adjust the action of the guitar. An oil finish is now used on the bridge and the fretboard. The body of the guitar can be sprayed with paraffin.